The idea of $200 silver sounds extreme when you hear it casually. It sounds like a headline designed to provoke clicks, but the reason banks don't want this scenario discussed openly has nothing to do with speculation. It has to do with structure, with what breaks long before silver ever reaches that number, and with what happens when confidence disappears faster than supply can be replaced. Right now, silver is still being treated as a trade, something that moves on forecasts, sentiment, and positioning. But beneath the surface, the market is already shifting into something far more rigid. Availability is tightening, delivery timelines are stretching, and institutions are quietly changing how they manage exposure, not because they expect prices to collapse, but because they are preparing for outcomes that don't fit neatly into pricing models. This is where the $200 scenario comes from, not from a straight line projection, not from inflation math, but from stress. From a market that is forced to reprice risk when assumptions stop holding. Banks don't fear high prices. They fear disorder. They fear a breakdown in settlement. They fear being caught guaranteeing delivery in a market where physical metal is no longer reliably available. March matters because it sits at the intersection of several pressures converging at once: contract rollovers, industrial procurement cycles, inventory disclosures, and policy decisions that quietly alter how metals move across borders. None of these events make headlines on their own, but together they compress timelines. The uncomfortable truth is that silver doesn't need new demand to break higher. It only needs existing demand to stop trusting the paper system that's been built around it. And once that trust starts to erode, price stops being the driver. Behavior becomes the signal. This is the part of the story that never makes it into bank research notes. To understand why banks are so cautious right now, you need to look at how exposed the silver market has become to assumptions that are no longer guaranteed. For decades, the system worked because most participants never asked for the metal itself. Futures rolled. ETFs tracked price. Industrial users relied on predictable delivery. Everything functioned smoothly as long as paper claims vastly outnumbered physical requests. That balance is now shifting. More buyers are insisting on real delivery, more contracts are being scrutinized for settlement terms, and more institutions are quietly reducing exposure to anything that could force them to source metal under stress. These are not dramatic moves. They are subtle adjustments made by people who see risk building before it becomes obvious. What's important here is scale. The silver market is small compared to other major commodities. A relatively modest change in behavior can have outsized effects. When a handful of large players decide they want physical instead of paper, inventories can drain quickly. And when inventories drain, prices don't move gradually. They reprice violently. Banks understand this better than anyone. They sit at the center of settlement. They guarantee performance. They are responsible when assumptions fail. That's why they don't want the $200 scenario discussed casually, because once the idea enters the public consciousness, behavior changes. People act preemptively. They secure supply earlier. They demand certainty. And certainty is exactly what the current system struggles to provide under pressure. The critical mistake most people make when hearing a number like $200 is assuming it requires extraordinary demand. It doesn't. It requires ordinary demand behaving differently. When industrial buyers, investors, and institutions all decide that access matters more than price, the market changes character. It becomes less about valuation and more about priority. Silver is especially vulnerable to this shift because of how little slack exists in the system. Annual production is largely spoken for before the year even begins. Much of it goes directly into manufacturing pipelines that cannot pause without consequences. Solar panels, power infrastructure, electronics, defense systems. These industries don't wait for price pullbacks. They secure material or risk shutdowns. At the same time, new supply cannot respond quickly. Most silver is produced as a byproduct of other mining operations. That means even sharp price increases don't immediately bring more metal to market. Mines don't open overnight. Refining capacity doesn't scale on demand. The result is a market where higher prices don't relieve pressure. They expose it. This is where the $200 scenario becomes plausible. Not because silver suddenly becomes more valuable in theory, but because it becomes scarce in practice. When availability tightens, price stops acting as a signal and starts acting as a rationing mechanism. Those who need silver urgently pay whatever is required. Those who can wait are forced to. Banks are acutely aware of this dynamic. They've seen it before in smaller markets. They know how quickly conditions can shift once physical stress appears. That's why they prefer this conversation stay quiet. Because once participants start behaving as if scarcity is real, it becomes real. March is where this pressure starts to concentrate, not because of a single event, but because multiple cycles overlap at the same time. Futures contracts roll, industrial procurement schedules reset, inventory reports update, and behind the scenes, banks reassess exposure based on what they've already seen over the previous months. When those processes align, small stresses can suddenly feel much larger. This is also when visibility drops. Public data always lags reality. By the time shortages show up clearly in reported inventories, the metal is already gone. What banks see internally is timing risk, the risk that demand arrives faster than supply can be sourced, the risk that delivery obligations cluster instead of spacing out, and the risk that counterparties all move in the same direction at once. When that happens, markets don't break because of panic. They break because of synchronization. Everyone tries to reduce risk simultaneously. Everyone tightens terms. Everyone asks the same questions about settlement. And liquidity that looked deep suddenly isn't. Banks don't want attention on this phase because attention accelerates it. If too many participants begin anticipating stress before March, behavior shifts earlier. Orders pull forward. Requests increase. Buffers disappear faster. The very act of preparing for disruption increases the probability of it occurring. That's why the $200 scenario isn't about forecasting price. It's about recognizing timing. When enough structural pressure concentrates in a narrow window, repricing can happen rapidly, without warning, and without clean entry points. At this stage, the biggest misunderstanding is assuming that banks would be surprised by a disorderly move. They wouldn't. What they fear is not the move itself, but being forced to manage it publicly. When stress builds quietly, institutions can adjust behind the scenes. They can reduce exposure, change terms, and prepare contingency plans. Once stress becomes visible, those options shrink. That's why so much of what matters now is happening off camera. Contracts are being reviewed more carefully. Delivery language is being emphasized. Some exposure is being shifted away from instruments that require physical performance. None of this makes headlines, but it reveals how risk is being perceived internally. If the market were truly comfortable, none of this would be necessary. Futures would roll smoothly. Inventories would reassure participants. Settlement would be assumed. The fact that banks are behaving defensively tells you the system is no longer operating on confidence alone. This is where price expectations start to disconnect from reality. $200 doesn't require a straight line move, it emerges from gaps. From moments when liquidity vanishes and price jumps to where sellers are finally willing to part with metal. Those jumps don't feel logical when they happen. They feel abrupt. But they are the natural outcome of prolonged pressure meeting limited supply. Banks understand this pattern. They just don't want it discussed openly because once the possibility is acknowledged, behavior accelerates. And in markets built on trust, acceleration is the real danger. What this ultimately comes down to is control. Silver is reaching a point where control is slipping away from models, forecasts, and institutional comfort. The $200 scenario isn't about optimism, it's about loss of flexibility. When supply can't be increased, when demand can't be deferred, and when trust in settlement weakens, price becomes the only variable left to adjust. March is important not because something must happen, but because it's where decisions converge. Some participants will choose to secure supply early, accepting higher costs in exchange for certainty. Others will wait, hoping conditions normalize. History shows that waiting is usually the more expensive option when markets are under structural stress. If silver does move sharply higher, it won't feel like a bubble. It will feel like a scramble, like a market suddenly discovering that what it assumed was available no longer is. And by the time that realization spreads, the repricing will already have occurred. This is why banks prefer silence. Not because the scenario is impossible, but because acknowledging it invites the very behavior that makes it unavoidable. Once enough participants stop trusting paper assurances and start prioritizing physical access, the system has to adapt quickly or fail publicly. The uncomfortable reality is that silver doesn't need extraordinary events to reach extraordinary prices. It only needs ordinary demand operating in a constrained system. That's the scenario forming now. And whether it resolves quietly or violently depends on how quickly the market confronts what it has been avoiding.